Welcome, everybody. I'm Paula. I'm the Secretary General of the European Digital Media Observatory. And together with Konrad, Bleyer-Simon, who is connected here, we will dive you into this training on the economics of disinformation. And our idea today was to bring back to some knowledge on how the various economic flow work actually behind this information. Just a quick note, you won't see formulas or strange thing here, because while we're talking about money and economics, I'm not an economist, Konrad neither, but I'm pretty sure we're still able actually to provide you with some very, if you want, more explanatory way of introducing concepts that are often somehow hidden into economic formulas. First of all, just very quickly, we tried also to help you in guiding you through this presentation. So we will go quickly through the table of content. We will start with the simplest, but actually still true story of disinformation and the monetization, moving then on the business of online platforms. We will then go also back to the news media, and also to see there, I mean, what happens there, both on the side of the business and on the side of disinformation. We will provide you with some examples of monetization of disinformation content. Then, of course, we would move to what is happening at EU level with the code of practice, and with the part on the monetization and also the structural indicators related to those, and then some conclusions. And the conclusions for us are very important. That's why you see conclusion discussion, because it's really what we also realize in this when working on this training is that there is still lots to be actually discussed when it's about the economics of disinformation. So we really hope that actually the conversation with you is going in two ways. So here I would give the floor to Konrad. We wanted to start first, of course, with some definitions and explanations about those.
Thank you, Paula. Yeah, before we start looking into the monetization of disinformation, it's important to understand what we mean by disinformation, because there are many different definitions of it. And many different aspects. So here we start with the code of practice on disinformation's definition, which is actually the definition of the European Democracy Action Plan. Yeah, and this is an updated definition, because the first edition of the code didn't mention political gain, just possible economic gain. So here we have this definition which says disinformation is false or misleading content that is spread with an intention to deceive or secure economic or political gain, and which may cause public harm. The public harm aspect is really important, because it means that we don't look at specific. So if I would, for example, tell you that I'm a flamingo, it would also be a piece of disinformation, but it doesn't really matter in this context, because I'm not going to harm anyone with it. So we are already narrowing it down a little bit by this harm aspect. And the problem with this definition for our purposes is that if we would try to understand why disinformation can be monetized, this definition would lead us to the conclusion that it can be monetized because it was done for economic gain, maybe. So that's why I wanted to look at some components that are usually mentioned in the context of disinformation on the policy discussions that help us define what we mean by the kind of disinformation that we want to act against, or or the effects of which we want to mitigate. I mean, the most important component, of course, is that it has to be verifiably false. And even there are some discussions, sometimes some controversies, because something that might be considered false by one person might not be false by the other. But in in most cases, we can still identify based on fact-checking whether something falls into this category. So we're not going to go into this discussion, what are the borderline cases and so on. We are just focusing on theory of why this is going to provide good monetization opportunities. It's also important to mention that it has to be intentionally spread. So the person who shares this information has to know that that piece of information is not factual, that it's misleading. It has to be potentially harmful. So the potentially harmful in this context means that it's either aimed at causing harm, or it has actually caused harm. It's concerning issues of public interest, especially public health and democratic participations. I mean, those two cases are clear why they are prominent in the definitions. We had two streams of disinformation in the past that were really visible. Actually, now we even have more than that, but at the beginning we had the election-related ones and the COVID-19 related ones. Now we also have ones that are related to conflicts, and there are many other forms as well. But yeah, and then it's usually strategically disseminated. So the person who shares this kind of information knows how they can reach the most people with it. There's the potential for economic gain, of course, and then there's the political gain. So it's either economic gain or political gain that they are aiming for. And I also have to make a note here that we refer to the phenomenon as disinformation, but many of the pieces of research that we will refer to actually use the word misinformation. There are people who refer to fake news still, and also platforms and some other researchers like to use the term misinformation or harmful misinformation. So these are different definitions. The European Commission and also EDMO prefers the disinformation definition because we believe it's much clearer. But don't be misled by the term misinformation. If you see it on the slides, it refers to the same concept. So we're still not explaining why exactly, that will come a bit later, why exactly disinformation is something that can be monetized easily. I will first highlight that there are three groups in this very simplified narrative who benefit from it. And the first group, the most obvious ones, are the bad actors, often just referred to as the Kremlin in most narratives, but of course there are lots of other bad actors as well who spread disinformation. And in their case, it's quite obvious the reason why they spread disinformation is because they want to achieve political goals with it. They want to influence an election or something else. But in order to have people who can spread disinformation, you have to pay an army of trolls who can work for you. So the most well-known case is the Internet Research Agency, which was run by Prigozhin, who was killed last year for other reasons by the person who used to pay him before. And in this case, you had people who were basically just publishing misleading stories on the internet in order to mislead people about issues related to public interest in Western democracies and other countries as well. We also know that online platforms are benefiting financially from this kind of activity because disinformation generates lots of clicks, lots of interactions, and therefore the monetization programs of online platforms, the advertising the advertising programs that they benefit from it because they can place advertising next to pieces on disinformation, which will reach more people, and that generates more revenues for them. But because these two criteria found each other, so there were people who were willing to produce this kind of information, and there were platforms who were benefiting from it. A group of other people, I call them small entrepreneurs because they are just people who realize that there is a business opportunity out there. Actually, they were smart teenagers in Macedonia and probably many other countries as well. They realized that you can make money with it. So they just started creating made-up stories and joined the monetization programs of the big online platforms. And they made massive amounts of money, apparently. We don't know the exact amounts, but they were pretty successful. So these were the three players that I would mention at the beginning, and then later the story will become more complex, but I give the floor to Paula now.
Thank you, Konrad. So we thought in a very simplified way, actually, to remind how this whole monetization works. So now we're talking about monetization in general. And here you see in the center, so we have a publisher or a content producer that would like to publish content, and he or she does it on an online platform. What happens is that actually the platform gathers the preferences of the visitors that are actually visiting this content or interacting with this content. And these preferences are quite something which is quite interesting for many actors, including advertisers. So what the platform do, they basically sell it to the advertisers who pay to get the space. Usually they bid actually for their clients. And then, of course, the clients, so the organization that would like to advertise their product, they pay the advertisers. And in all of that, of course, a percentage goes, of course, also to one part goes to the publisher and one part stays, of course, in the online platform. On top of that, of course, as we know, the publishers, they can also pay to get their content promoted. And this is where the relationship is way easier. And this is the arrow you see here with this on the other side, which is basically that the publisher, once the content is published, pays to get the content more visible. So this is what's happening. And in the meantime, and this is, I mean, we thought it wouldn't be useful actually now to go back to the basis and to Rocher Tirol and the two-sided market, but just to remind that, of course, in this whole story, then what happens is that, of course, the users, in any case, are getting the content, let's say, for free, because, of course, actually they are paying with their preferences, but there is no money flow from the users to get that content. The money flows basically from the platform to the basically, as you can see, from the content producer to the platform when it's for promoting content, and otherwise the money goes to the publisher, to the platforms, from the advertisers that actually also are paid by the organization that want to advertise their products. So this is the simplified version, also because we know there are many other, actually also other actors like advertiser networks that are like in this part related to advertising, but this was for us a way to set the scene and to show where the money comes, because this actually helps in understanding where you can actually monetize on this information. So before going back to how you monetize on it, just to go back to what Konrad was also saying before, an intentional lie alone, of course, is not enough to make money. You have to make sure that this lie is actually further shared and goes viral, so that actually it is of appetite of the advertising sector. So indeed, the aim of the publisher is actually to reach people. And to do that, one strategy could actually be to have controversial or divisive content, because they attract views and shares. And this is something that many psychologists and neuroscientists also confirm. And this is something that it is somehow, or I would say, a rule of thumb in the sector, because it's quite known, if you want. What do the social media algorithms do? They basically work to make sure that that ranking is based on engagement. So the more the views, the more time is spent on social media, and the more advertising is sold, also because the more actually preferences by the users are gathered and then sold. And this, to go back to what we're saying also previously, is very important, as it was said also in the past. Without amplification, disinformation goes nowhere, and I would say it's also not harmful. What makes it actually harmful is the fact that it is spread quite widely on the web, and that makes this information also content on which people can monetize on. In parallel to that, what is interesting to highlight is that disinformation is the cheapest and safest controversial content. It is cheap because it doesn't have research costs, and also it has very low production costs, as we see often. I mean, of course, we are rightly so very worried about AI and generative AI, but actually it is still quite easy to produce disinformation, even in a very, if you want, antique way, just putting a picture out of context or doing wrong translation of official text and so on. So the production costs are quite low, and it is not illegal. So it is not subject to removal, which, of course, let's be fair, very clear, we are not here advocating that it should be removed. Indeed, fundamental rights are to be respected. So it is very cheap, and you can play with the money flows that we were presenting earlier, actually, to monetize on it. So if you think now at the picture that we had shown previously, how does that apply to what we were saying? So content can be pushed on the social media as such, and as such also disinformation content. So you push, as I was saying, this was the arrow on the right, you push a content on social media, and if this content contains disinformation, this content is pushed. Then, of course, and this is paid campaigns, so it's a relationship between the publisher and the online platforms. This can go into the extreme cases then to the bots and trolls that Konrad was mentioning previously. But here, of course, the relationship is not anymore between the platform and the publisher. This is important to mention. It's rather between the publisher and the armies of the bots and the trolls. Then you have content. Content can also be published on the website. And for those who actually participated in the previous session with GDI, I mean, the presentation by Claire Melford was quite clear on that. And there are actually websites which are systematically sharing this information. So these are systematic purveyors of disinformation. And here it's where the advertisers compete to get a space on those websites. And often, and this is what the point of GDI often is, that the organizations that are basically willing to promote their products are even not aware about the fact that their products are promoted actually on websites that are spreading this information. Now, moving back to content published on social media, here again, the advertisers, they compete to add their ads next or in the content that is published on social media. We also added here issue-based advertising. For those who are not familiar with issue-based advertising, this is a sort of political advertising, actually. So basically, it's content that is trying to build an awareness on subjects that are of public interest, like climate change, migration, and so on. And it is basically published to create some consensus around that content. And this is quite a tricky situation because this is paid content. So actually, publishers pay to put that content online to promote it. And as we know, there is the code itself and other regulations also on transparency of political advertising are making sure that actually there is full transparency on that, so that the users are aware about the fact that this is indeed content for which actually there was a payment to get it there. Konrad, you can close with this part.
Yeah, thank you. So this is a slide that will return a bit later again. So I will just really quickly say some words about it. So we wanted to emphasize that advertising is not the only way to make money through disinformation. So there are multiple forms of advertising. So even when we talk about ads, there are many different ways. Some of them are at the beginning of a video. Others are placed on a website that has nothing to do with any of the online platforms that we're talking about, but the ad itself is provided by one of the online platforms. Apart from that, there are examples of crowdfunding and donations given to disinformation, purveyors of disinformation. In many cases, not even through actual money, but or the kind of money that we are familiar with, but through tokens. So different, I don't know, children's money, or so alternative money with symbolic value or cryptocurrency. There are also cases when purveyors of disinformation just start selling their own merchandise. I mean, the best known example for all of us is, of course, the Make America Great Again baseball cap, but I'm not going to say now that Donald Trump is spreading disinformation, but there are lots of other actors who, similarly to him, have their own branded products, and they try to make money by just linking to an online marketplace where you can buy it. There's also e-commerce, so sometimes they are purveyors of disinformation, just try to sell other things, or not even sell them, but they link to vendors so that in cases you buy something from, let's say, Amazon's website, you get a cut, or the purveyor of disinformation gets a cut from the proceeds. There's also sponsoring, especially in the case of influencers. You know this phenomenon quite well. And of course, we can imagine that there are also secret bank transfers, or actually, to make it more secret, it can be a suitcase full of money, or that there are multiple ways to fund them that we can't even figure out. Advertising is just one of them, but probably the most visible one. Yeah, and we also wanted to come back to this question of economic gain versus political gain, because we mentioned these two players. The first player was, of course, the Prigozhin troll factory. The other one was the so-called Macedonian teenagers. So basically groups who want to influence people and groups who want to make money. And these two groups have different strategies, of course, because the ones who want to influence people are willing to invest, to put money into their disinformation, because of course it's important for them to reach the right people. You can reach the right people through proper targeting, through yeah, basically through targeting and through finding the best channel for it. But the other people who create it for economic gain, they don't really care who's going to read it. They don't really care if the person who reads it is going to be misled by it or not. I mean, maybe to the degree that they want people to continue reading them, because the more people read them, the more money they get. But they really don't care about the economic effects. So for that reason, you have, and you will also see this in the policy discussion, when we talk about monetization of disinformation, then there is the kind of monetization where purveyors of disinformation buy advertising space, or they boost their posts or their articles, or they do issue-based advertising. And there are the cases where they just join the monetization programs of online platforms, and you will see examples for all of them in this presentation later.
All right, so now don't get scared. I also got scared when I did this slide, and I have to say I initially did it on paper and then tried to put it here. So we started by saying that we would like to make life easy and simple, but we thought it's still important to kind of go a little back, if you want a helicopter view, and give you kind of a context here. So, or more details even. So you can see in the middle, starting from the online platforms, I mean, I'm not saying anything news if I say that they change the way news are consumed. They change the quality of the news. They change the way news are communicated, the quantity of the news, of course, which, I mean, we are not putting any value judgment here. In any case, often actually, of course, it's also for the positive. So this, the platforms, what do they do? By definition, they build communities. I mean, if we look back also at how Facebook, for example, was built at the beginning, was, of course, not to build, to give a tool for the community. Now, they give this tool to the community with zero monetary price for the users. As we were saying before, the users don't pay to get the service. Now, some platforms then have added the premium part, but the way the business starts is actually with freemium, so zero monetary price for the users. So how can that work? Of course, the business models are based on advertising. And as we were saying, in order for this this model to be of appetite for the advertisers, it is important that the content gets viral. So basically, that many people see it, and the algorithms are of course trained to make sure that content gets viral. As we were saying previously, how does this work? You have to have tendentially it exploits the psychological biases of human beings, like the fact that we would like to be accepted within the community, that we tend to stay in our echo chambers, that we look for confirmation, that we have a confirmation bias system, so we look for confirmation of our beliefs, by the fact that it creates addiction. And in creating addiction, on top of that, first, there is a high price for quitting. So if you decide to quit a platform like Instagram or so on, you have the feeling of being out of something where all of your friends and all the other people's are. And still, in any case, you don't actually question the fact that you're getting everything for €0, basically. And then there is the fact that the more content actually is emotional, and as the psychologists tell us, the more actually it goes on the negative emotions like fear or worry or angry. And in general, the more sensational the content is, the more it gets viral. So, and now, to go back on the monetization side, monetization, of course, is done by the advertising placement agency, by the producers of content, by the trolls, as a consequence, of course. It can be exploited by malicious actors, as Konrad was mentioning before. And then, of course, there is monetization of the platform. But what we wanted to bring back here is also the traditional media, because, of course, their business models were quite impacted by the advent of the online platforms. And that's how actually, as a consequence, they changed the way of producing content. So not only did they unfortunately had to lay off some of part of their team, but they also the quality of the content somehow changed. And they moved to clickbait. So we see more and more also on like more traditional media outlets content that is actually seeking attention and fighting for clickbait. Content is more sensational, and there is this speed race, which unfortunately is not something good for disinformation, because the risk is that that actually content that is produced by traditional media is containing disinformation because it is not checked enough, nor the source nor the content. So this is just to say that while we started, of course, with focusing on disinformation and platforms, disinformation is also spread on traditional media. Another example is also, for example, when the headlines are actually somehow not very clear, and they tend to also share disinformation. You see here one point that we wanted to highlight still again is how cheap it is to produce this information. So in all this system, which is quite complex and where the money flows are changing, producing this information still is very cheap. So I hope you digested this slide. I'm sorry for bringing so much content on one slide. And now I think I give the floor to Konrad back. That actually introduces a term that I'm not sure everybody knows, though is actually the word of the year of 2023.
Yeah, actually, I didn't know either that it's the word of the year. I knew the word, but I didn't know that it's so popular. So it's the word enshittification, which is, according to the American Dialect Society, the word of the year. It's what it means is worsening of a digital platform through reduction in quality of service. And based on this term, I mean, it already shows something, that if you need to create a new word that means such a complex thing, that means that it probably happens with many platforms. And this term comes from Cory Doctorow, who's an internet researcher, activist, and science fiction writer. And he argues that we are arriving to a state of capitalism where big online platforms turn into monopolies, and so they are monopolies on the one hand, so they dominate the sector where they are. And he also argues that they only dominate one sector and they are unable to get into different sectors. So for example, he would regard Google only as an search and advertising company, which sells advertising based on search. And for that reason, he believes that it's impossible for Google to increase its revenues by convincing way more people to use it, because there are no people out there who don't know about Google and could be convinced to use it because it's a great search engine. But at the same time, they have shareholders who demand growth, who demand to see returns on their money. So the only way they can do that is by decreasing the quality of their services. They lay down people. We could see that with many of these online platforms in the last year or two, that they laid down thousands or maybe even 10,000s of people who work there. Often people who work in the groups that are supposed to secure the integrity of the platforms, who are supposed to find ways of safeguarding users from disinformation. But at the same time, there are also these so-called network effects, which Cory Doctorow also describes in his book. These mean that it's really impossible or almost impossible to leave the platforms, because you started using it for free. All your friends were using them for free. And if you would leave Facebook, you would leave behind the 3,000 friends that you have, 2,000 of whom use Messenger to message you. And of course, if they send you a message on Messenger and you're not on Facebook, you're not going to see it, or they won't even be able to message you, and you just don't want to give it up. So basically, everyone is kind of captured in this environment. And here I wanted to show just two tweets by Cory Doctorow where he puts this term into context. So he says, "And shitification truly is how platforms die. That's fine, actually. We don't need eternal rulers of the internet. It's okay for new ideas and new ways of working to emerge." And you can also see, based on the next tweet, that he has an example of a platform which he sees as extremely enshittified. So here he writes, "Today, Facebook is terminally enshittified, a terrible place to be, whether you're a user, a media company, or an advertiser." I hope that these are two examples that you can afterwards try in a cocktail party. I mean, I was also trying to do that over some chit chat or small talk in the future. And we can go to the next slide then.
So of course, what Konrad wanted to say is that there are new words that are coming up with new phenomena that are somehow monitored, especially considering what happened in the recent, I would say, year in which were large layoffs. So now a little back to what we were saying earlier. This is what the UN we want to just come up with this quote, which is quite. The reason why we're putting it here, because it is quite actually clear, and this is a UN document. This is quite, if we want, global. So to maximize profits, of course, algorithms are programmed to increase engagement by maximizing the variety of the content, as we were saying. And this is important, which often promotes highly incendiary, controversial, or polarizing content to drive the interactions. And this is the second part. This increases exposure to unhealthy content, often based on mis or false information, significantly impairing conscious decision-making and risk creating addiction, desensitization, and radicalization. So this was just to reconfirm what we were saying earlier, and also to bridge to this second part, which is before indeed moving ahead, also to the second part of this presentation, we wanted just to do a step back. So whatever we said now, as you all know, is inserted into what is called the attention economy. So there is, as we were saying, lots of information outside there, so an abundant supply of information that is immediately available. But of course, the demand is limited by attention time. We cannot actually be interested in all this news, and even if we would be interested in all, we wouldn't have the time actually to read and digest all the news that we can find on the online. So that's why the economists say the price of attention, of course, is going up, because basically there is a competition on who makes it possible to actually get the most attention of the users. And it's not by chance actually that we saw, for example, that communication is moving from text to images, no? Because this makes the attention actually of, I mean, the need of the time of attention that is asked to the citizens shorter than by going through a long text. Or, for example, when it's about a text, we often find the time that it takes to read it. So we are already kind of helped on that. The point is that when there is limited time and attention, we all actually tend to kind of rely more on our brain and on our intuitions. And so basically we are in a situation in which actually we risk us falling more into disinformation, because basically we are stepping from one information content to the other without giving it the proper attention that we usually did in the past. The fact is that in this whole battle in which actually players are competing in getting attention, disinformation is actually used to attract that attention. That's that content that actually where actually our many people just stop or take 1 second or 1 minute more to actually go through it. And I mean, there are even researchers arguing that attention has become a more valuable currency than the kind you store in bank accounts, also because attention is a scarce resource. I mean, we won't have more than 24 hours a day, in which we also have, in any case, to do some vital other stuff. So it's not something that can that is unlimited. It is actually very limited. So it's a competition of a resource that is limited. And now back to you, Konrad.
Yeah, thank you. So here I'm going to more or less repeat what we've said before, but wanted to bring an example where which shows that artificial intelligence is used to actually train these models. In the case of Facebook, which is one of these platforms where you have experienced a lot of disinformation, creating lots of engagement, you see that there is a machine learning program called the FB Learner, which they train with content, or which they train with data that they collected from the users. I mean, this is also where Shoshana Zuboff's idea of surveillance capitalism comes in, because a lot of but you know that quite well. Why? But basically a lot of the business of online platforms is based on the data that is collected. This is used in order to basically try to predict how people would react in the future, and also to predict, to figure out how to best target your content to people. And that was, for example, misused in the case of the famous Cambridge Analytica scandal, where targeted advertising was sent to different subsets of the population with different aims. I mean, the overall aim was the same, but sometimes it was the aim to discourage people from voting. In other cases, it was to convince them to vote for a specific candidate. And they could do that because they managed to identify which person would resonate, or which message would resonate to which person. And basically, a similar idea is visible in the case of Facebook, where they have these engagement-based ranking models, which are created again and again. So the algorithm is fed with information about the people who are using the platform, and it tries to figure out what kind of content will create the most interaction, because advertising is also paid after interactions. And also the more interaction you have, the more likely people are to stay on the platform. Because of that, they created these models. And of course, they realized that the most engaging content is the one that is outrageous, which is divisive, and which is often disinformation, but there are also lots of other kinds of hate speech and other kinds of contents. We can go to the next slide, I think. Here I would like to just share a quote from Tarleton Gillespie. He's one of the most well-known online platform researchers. So he says, according to Zuckerberg, users are invariably drawn to sensationalist and provocative content. Wherever a line is drawn, interest balloons alongside. I'm not going to finish this quote. You can take a screenshot if you want, but I would go to the next slide because that's what this quote refers to. In 2018, Mark Zuckerberg gave a presentation to his employees in which he tried to explain his business model and how to deal with it. And some researchers refer to this as an admission because basically if you look at this slide on the top of the page, it has an X and a Y axis, and on the Y axis you can see that the more problematic a piece of content. So you go to the right, and the more to the right you go, the more problematic a piece of content will be. The policy line is the one where a piece of content becomes illegal. So disinformation is the content, the last piece of outrageous content that is still legal. While afterwards you have hate speech that is already legal, and then there's also another and a lot of other kind of illegal content. Of course, I mean it's really hard to draw. I mean to say that a piece of content is more illegal or less illegal because piece of content is either illegal or not. Anyway, but he argues that the closer a piece of content is to like breaking the taboo of turning into an illegal, forbidden content, the more likely it is that people will click on it, that people will react to it, and so on. And that's why their business model has to take this into consideration. And his proposal here is that they would just continue using this engagement-based model, but they would create, so by they I mean Facebook. Facebook would create another tool which would start filtering the problematic pieces of content. So they wouldn't remove this content, they would just downrank it, and they would try to identify it. Of course, people who know how AI works and who work a lot on this topic, they were really critical of this idea because they believed that it's impossible to create a system which first amplifies this information and then decides to pick out the problematic pieces of this information and just demotes them, because purveyors of this information will probably find ways to game the system. We can go to the next slide. And here I wanted to give an example, which actually is a proof of this thing happening in practice. And it's a leaked paper written by Jeff Allen of the Integrity Institute. Back then, he was still working for Facebook. And now the Integrity Institute is one of our partners at EDMO. This is the paper that he sent to Facebook before he resigned. He was one of the people who identified the troll farms, the Macedonian troll farms on Facebook. And we can go to the next slide. And in this memo, he explained to Facebook that these troll farms, actually, they were in Kosovo and Macedonia, from what I remember. I mean, they were most active there. I lost the slide.
I also lost him.
He realized that these troll farms were so effective that the largest Christian American community, which catered to Christian Americans, was actually run by Macedonian teenagers who were neither Christian, well, maybe they were Christian, but probably not church-going, and according to the content that they posted, and also not American. But also the largest voice of African Americans was also created by Macedonians. And the second largest voice in the Native American community was also created by troll farms. So basically, these communities, instead of getting content that is created by their community for them to inform them about actual things, they received a bunch of memes created by people who claimed to be members of their community but weren't. We can go to the next slide. And apparently 75% of the people who saw this content weren't following these pages, never liked them, never decided that they wanted to get this content. It was just amplified because it worked so well with the algorithms. Jeff has 3 points as a key takeaway for his company. He says there are 3 fundamental properties of our platform that enable them: easily exploited engagement-based ranking system, a lack of basic media literacy checks to influence ranking, and edge stories which expand reach beyond direct fans. And we can go to the next slide. Now, I wanted to just show 2 examples of studies that give a bit of more context, because now we saw that, amplification will probably mean that more people will see it. And this was also the case in this Edelson study, which found that misinformation got 6 times the amount of likes, shares, and interactions than content from trustworthy sources. So again, misinformation here means what we would refer to as disinformation. But at the same time, they also found that the people who were most affected by it, or who saw most disinformation, they were consumers of the far-right content. So it's not like all of us were to the same degree influenced by disinformation content. Some communities are more influenced, others aren't, and we still don't know how and whether all of the people who consume this content were misled by it. Maybe it just showed up on their screen and then they just realized that it's some annoying spam. We don't know. So we don't want to make the argument with what we said before, that disinformation is also 6 times more effective, or that disinformation, when it reaches us, will mislead us about what we know about the world. And we can also go to the next slide, which is a study from the European context. They also, they found that the effect was maybe not as extreme in the European context as it was in the US, but looking at Facebook and Twitter, they found that 1.2 to 4 times as many likes, comments, and shares came to pieces of disinformation than to trustworthy content. But at the same time, they say that on Facebook, junk news outlets tended to receive more engagement per story, but are seen, shared, and liked by far less people overall. I mean, it's a good message. We can be happy about it, but at the same time, we also have to keep in our mind that it was 2018, 2019, so 5 or 6 years have passed since. The situation might have changed. But we still don't know for sure, like 100%, how it's going to influence people. We can go to the next slide.
So now, before we move to that, just one thing for those who don't know the Macedonian teenager case, because we mentioned it quite a lot. What happened was during the Trump campaign, basically, as Konrad was saying, researchers realized that lots of disinformation content was actually arriving from Macedonia, and there was like a question, how is this possible? And what they realized is that there was a group of teenagers actually that were basically copy pasting pro-Trump content in other websites and further promoting it, sharing it. When interviewed by Wired, I think they were asked why they were doing that, and they told we wanted to buy a BMW. So this is why also Konrad was saying, no, the famous entrepreneurs. And this, however, also shows clearly how political content can actually be, you may think it's just for political purposes, but actually there the purpose was for economic gain. So the two are actually getting mixed in some occasions. So this was just a very short note for those who don't know about this case. Now, before we go ahead, we have a poll for you. And I hope Miriam will show it now on screen. Okay. So feel free to actually reply to this first question, which is, according to you, by how much in percentage did the advertising revenue of the New York Times decrease between 2006 and 2021? So now we have a second poll. Now the question is, by how much actually advertising revenues have increased for Facebook between 2000, I think it was 9 and 21 now, not 2006, but it will appear soon. This is the answer. So it's 77% loss of the New York Times, and I don't know how to say that, but 15,077% increase in Meta's advertising revenue. So you can clearly see the difference in like numbers, but also how, if you want, much effective, if you want, the platform business model is. Of course, here we're talking about news. On Meta might be also other content. So this is something that we have to take into consideration. But I mean, we thought it's quite an impressive numbers that we wanted to share with you. And congratulations, especially to those that in the Meta's question went to the thousands actually. Now, what we learned in the last years, indeed, is that the way the two-sided market for traditional media, so the part based on advertising, was built is somehow gone. It's not totally, but it was clearly impacted. The audiences and the advertisers tend to migrate to social media. Of course, there are exceptions. Think of, for example, The Economist, which is quite quality and specialized. It still resists, or others. But in general, there was a drop. The news media, they follow them, of course. There is an increased vulnerability, and there are, as we were saying before, desperate attempts actually to still cope with that, like for example, with clickbaits and others, where indeed the idea is to basically catch the attention with some cheap content, or either they catch attention with cheap content, or they put jointly cheap content and rather more journalistic, if you want, quality journalism content together. But again, if we think about what we were saying before in the attention economy, and that actually there is a competition in getting that attention, clearly there is a shift towards different, let's say, ways of sharing news as to get that attention. And this also, of course, brings also to new forms of news media. For example, we see in many countries the appearance of this news media where the news is explained in a 1-minute video or in a 1-minute podcast. And this is how actually very often news are accessed by, especially by new generation, with, of course, and this is something that we also often say, the different that many often there are less, for example, there is less security for the employees, the contracts are often part-time, not all are there to ethical standards, and so on. But this was just to go back to what we were saying at the beginning, news media in the traditional way and the platforms to show or to confirm what we often say, that everything has dramatically changed. Now, Konrad actually has some very, very, I would almost say funny examples on fabricated stories that made it actually in the mainstream media. Some you wouldn't even believe. So I give back the floor to Konrad.
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, some of you probably saw The Wire. So if you didn't manage to get to the 5th season, I can really recommend it. One of the heroes is a journalist at the Baltimore Sun who actually, for similar reasons as we've seen before, because there's increased competition, less job security, he had to just prove that he's one of the best journalists there in order to get the good job. And then afterwards, I think he even wins the Pulitzer Prize. Sorry for the spoiler. And by the way by which he does it is he just makes up stories. He makes up quotes. He creates this impression that he was the only one who spoke to the serial murderer who's terrorizing the city. And he even made fake phone calls to himself. There's also another famous story. I mean, there are lots of German examples, actually. I don't know why, but there was this big revelation in I think it was the 80s, when the weekly Stern decided to publish the long-lost diaries of Hitler, which they found. And apparently someone put some effort into recreating the diaries, at least the first one. The second and the third was apparently just a bunch of empty pages, which they showed as apparent proof. And then, of course, it turned out that it had nothing to do with reality. And actually, one of my favorite ones is Tom Kummer. He's also a German journalist who was the most popular celebrity interviewer at the time. He, for example, made an interview with Mike Tyson, in which Mike Tyson first admitted to him that he was eating cockroaches in prison to get enough protein. And then afterwards, they were talking about metaphysics and the works of Kant and whatever. And of course, his editors loved it, that he managed to get to show this unknown side of people. Like, I think they also spoke with Courtney Love about philosophy, and like lots of other people. And then, of course, it turned out that it wasn't true, but everyone in the business had to follow his example. Everyone was told, why can't you just bring us stories the same way as Tom Kummer? I mean, I think in his case, it's probably a bit different than in others, because the reason why he could do that was that there was no internet at the time, so you could just make up a story in a German language outlet about someone who doesn't speak German, and they will probably never find out. But there was an interview with him, because apparently he became a celebrity afterwards. He even wrote a book, and he said they all loved it and wanted more readers, movie distribution people in Germany, advertisers and editors. I was convinced that the editors knew everything. Nobody asked for tapes. Nobody asked for any kind of proof for more than 6 years, but they refused to admit it. I was playing the violin for them. So this is also an example that shows that lies just work, also in journalism. And the reason why I still wouldn't call most of these stories disinformation is because I would say that it's not well, the persons themselves were intentional in misleading, but this is an error in the system. Some bad apples got into a journalistic outlet, and probably also because, well, because it's driven by revenues that it has to generate, but also because it became much weaker, and all its mechanisms that it used to have in the past to make sure that the stories are verified are weaker than in the past. Like Klaas Relotius, the other example in Germany, he managed to mislead the whole fact-checking department of Der Spiegel. Apparently, Der Spiegel has the biggest fact-checking department in Germany. Still, no one managed to realize that he was just faking stories for 10 years. And maybe at the end, I would show or mention two of the examples from the end of the list in the previous slides, because I also mentioned the Hungarian public service media, and another, I don't know what the other example was. Those are also creators of disinformation, but in that case, I would say that it's intentional and it can be regarded disinformation. The reason why they exist in this form is also an outcome of the problems that we have described in the previous slides, because there is this example of media capture that you can see all over the world. It means that media are just not as strong as they used to be. They cannot withstand pressure from economic interest groups or political interest groups. And it's just much easier for a person who's rich and powerful to just capture them and then just misuse them for their own means. And then I would just go to the next slide. Oh yeah, and now we have the examples of monetization, and we're returning to the question of the Macedonian teenagers. Jeff, in his leaked memo, also had a point which started with, why do they do it? he says money is definitely a big reason. There are a few ways to monetize on Facebook. You can link the domain where you show ads. So basically, you create a website where you have a disinformation story and you have a monetization program there. I think the reason why Facebook didn't like it, according to lots of explanations, was that if you manage to generate some clicks for a content that leads to a website that is outside Facebook, it would, of course, enrich Google, because those sites will then use Google advertising. So that's why Facebook created its own partnership programs, the instant articles and the ad breaks, where you can already place advertising and monetize advertising content through Facebook. There are also examples of sponsored hosting and sharing. And he says that it's also possible to sell the page after it reaches a large size. So apparently, if you have like 100,000 or 1 million followers, your page becomes really valuable and you can just sell it on the black market, on the Facebook black market. We can go to the next slide. And this is a study which is also available, or at least the slideshow of it is available on the European Parliament's website. So the Global Disinformation Index gave a presentation to the European Parliament on their assessment of the monetization of disinformation. And so they found that 76 million US dollars in ad revenues were created through disinformation sites targeting EU members. I think this also responds to the question of one of our attendees in the Q&A. I don't know in which period they made this calculation, but they did this by basically identifying a list of purveyors of disinformation and then checking whether they are part of monetization programs or not. And based on the CPIs, they made a guess on the money that they could have created based on the views that they had on their sites. So at the time, the industry standard the CPI was I think 70 cents after 1,000 views, and based on that they tried to come up with a number, and this is the 76 million in ad revenues. But the authors believe that this is probably a very conservative number and it's even more. And in that slideshow you will see that lots of well-known brands, banks and Deutsche Bahn in Germany and hotel chains and basically everyone, Adidas, I think, maybe not, but like well-known brands were featured on these websites. And the main ad service that was serving these advertisements was, of course, Google, with something like 70% or so. But there are also 4 other big players: Criteo, Taboola, OpenX, and Xandr, which are not that well known. And but they also had a relatively big share, and according to that, also lots of earnings from these kinds of activities. They also calculated that apparently Russia Today, Sputnik, and Breitbart made around 700,000 euros, US dollars per month through these ads on their website. At the same time, they also mention other ways of monetization: e-commerce, merchandise on Amazon. So basically, you could click on a link that led you to Amazon, and then you could buy a T-shirt which says "I'm white, male, and proud of it," or something like that. And there are also e-payment and donation websites like PayPal, Patreon, and others, which were also used to send money to purveyors of disinformation. And I would believe that on crowdfunding sites, you can also make an assessment you can also try to calculate how much money is collected for purveyors of disinformation because many of the campaigns that you run there are open. So that's another way of coming up with a guess. But we will also look into some other ways, and our proposal for the and in the context of the code of practice of disinformation, which also has some approaches of trying to quantify it. But we can go to the next slide now.
Yeah, I just wanted to say that these well-known brands very often were even not aware about the fact that their ads were put actually in such website. And actually, if I remember correctly, recently GDI even found some such content also like related to UNICEF on UNICEF website. So really often they're even not aware. This is important to say. Voila. Maybe you said that already.
Yeah, I think we don't have to repeat it. I just wanted to bring the example of another website because or another platform, just because we're talking too much about Facebook, and it might sound like Facebook is the only one, but it's not true at all. In the previous slide, in the case of GDI, at least we saw that Google is also a big player, and there is Twitch. Maybe many of you don't even know what it is. It's basically a live streaming platform which is owned by Amazon, and they're also one of the signatories of the Code of Practice of Disinformation. There were some articles that argued that there are lots of purveyors of disinformation who decided to move to this platform, so they are live streaming their content. There are also lots of far-right activists who are there, and I don't know, I think there isn't enough research about the extent of the problem, but the reason why I found them interesting is because they have 3 ways of monetization, and 2 of them are a bit different from what we've seen before. The first one is channel subscriptions. So basically you can, for €5, you can sign up for a website, of course, that or a content creator. So that of course means that you already have to be interested in this content creator. And it also means that maybe some other people will not reach or not be affected by this content, but still it's a form of monetization. And there are bits. So bits are these tokens, these it's basically a form of money that's only accepted on the platform, and you can pay tips with these bits if you like someone's content. One bit is like 1 cent, but you can pay, I don't know, 10,000 bits if you really liked something. And the purveyor of this information, or anyone who gets bits, can afterwards go back to the company, to Twitch, and sell back with a 20% loss that bit. So basically, this is how, instead of money, you get some alternative money, of which the platform will receive a cut. And of course, there are ads, but those we know already. So we can go to the next slide. I think it's not, we don't have to talk a lot about it. I just wanted to show another example that there are also purveyors of disinformation that collect money through cryptocurrencies, usually in order to be less traceable. The EU Disinfo Lab did a study on that, and I can recommend it to you. And they also managed to quantify that, and you can go to the next slide. So they managed to calculate how much money they made through the use of different kinds of cryptocurrencies. And we can go to the next slide again. Yeah, there is the EU policy, and that's you.
Indeed. So in these slides, we just anticipate what you can. I mean, you all know is in the code of practice on the monetization, and we will get back to that. So, of course, how can we try to demonetize this information? So, of course, in any case, make advertising transparent. So you have, for example, ad libraries for political advertising, or for targeting information, or information for who paid for what and how much and so on. Then there should be some scrutiny. and which means also having eligibility criteria for advertising and some specific monetization programs and advertising. So it's advertiser and advertising. So who and what, so on the content. And then, of course, cooperation across the monetization of value chain. So really going through the whole actor set that we were mentioning throughout this training. And also we could consider alternative forms of ranking and, of course, stricter targeting rules. And this is where also, I mean, what you see here is probably not something new, because it's something that is quite heavily discussed in the policy sector as well. But maybe it is a first part of the reply to one question that was said: how can the organizations don't know that they are promoted on websites that are spreading this information? This already shows how many different actors are actually involved. And if we now move actually also to the code of practice, maybe it's not important now, because also in the interest of time, to read again the commitments. As you can see, what we put here is the first, which is indeed the one on the monetization, but we also, of course, included those who are not called the monetization, but are still very relevant. So here the signatories, and it's important to say that the signatories, they all they subscribe to the measures that are relevant for them. The signatories, they participate in ad placement, they commit to fund the dissemination of this information and to improve the policies and the system to determine also the eligibility, back to the slide before, of content that can be monetized. And of course, now other signatories, so in the advertising sector, they commit to prevent the misuse of the advertising system to disseminate this information in the form of advertising messages, because this is what is happening as well. So I won't go through the reading of this whole, but I just wanted to bring you here, because one thing that I tend to test is how easily it is to actually get information, what is allowed or what is not allowed on a platform, or in general to know the rules. I have to admit that probably many instructions are there, but it's quite hard to get to those, because it's always like, if you want to know that, go to the X policy, and then from there you link to another and to another. So it's quite a challenge, I would say. But here what you could say is that, for example, Meta says that this information, here we're talking about now the ads part. And here you see the following types of content are ineligible to monetize, and misinformation is included: content that has been rated false by a third-party fact checker. So this assumes that Meta is actually collaborating with third-party fact checkers that are actually verifying content, and whenever that content was actually fact-checked and by fact checkers, and it is labeled as misinformation, that there shouldn't be the possibility to monetize on that. And of course, there is also something specific on misleading medical information. Now, on YouTube, what you can see is that the first on the left is actually the content on which you can earn ad revenue. And you see there are still, you see medical and scientific misinformation, harmful misinformation, but if you read them carefully, you can see, for example, in harmful disinformation, it's like educational or documentary content seeking to explain how actually misinformation is promoted. And then there is a whole part where content is actually not allowed, and you see there is some specific very long on medical disinformation, and then in general harmful disinformation, which is prohibited. So in theory, and this is where also the code of practice comes in theory, there are also already policies within the platforms that this is not allowed. But of course, there is still a question if this is always happening. So where's the transparency? Who is controlling? Is this really effective? So these were just two examples to show that publishers who want to publish their content on these platforms, they're invited by the platforms, of course, when they want to monetize on the content, to have a look at this. And of course, also the ad sector is invited to do so. Now, this is really the last part. We are already running against time, but we wanted to actually deep dive a little into the structural indicators, because as you may know, these are the indicators that somehow need to assess the effectiveness of the code on disinformation. And as many of you may know, because we kind of said that quite often, EDMO has worked in the last years on a methodology actually to think on how to produce those indicators. It's not an easy exercise considering that it's the first of its kind. So it was a very inclusive exercise in which many experts were actually involved. And I would give it now, I think, to Konrad to do this and the next slide, and then I will conclude, and then we will open for Q&A.
Yes, thank you, Paula. Yeah, I think we can go to the next slide. And oh no, maybe let's just go back again. Yeah, because there's a link that I wanted to refer to. So there has been a first assessment of the code of the structural indicators, which can be found on the disinfocode.eu website. You can also find all the reports of the platform signatories there. So also they're reporting on what they have done in order to fulfill the commitments of the code of practice on disinformation. And there was a question earlier whether the EU is doing anything in relation to political advertising. So here I would just highlight that the code of practice has one pillar which actually focuses on political advertising. There is also a discussion on regulation on political advertising. There are also lots of discussions on figuring out a way to deal with issue-based advertising that Paula mentioned before. So basically, advertising that can still mislead people or even support a political party because it might advocate for a topic which is only represented by one topic, but the money doesn't come from the party, and the money also, or no, the advertising also doesn't show that this is done for a party. So this happens. Also, a lot of we see that many of the platforms now have ad libraries, or they just decided not to allow political advertising at all. This is also an outcome of the policy process, because many of them just decided that it's too much of a hassle for them to make it a transparent system, and they just decided to not accept money from political advertisers. And this is already an outcome, because that means that at least there is less of a chance to misuse this kind of advertising on their services. And now we can go to the next slide, which is an example of the structural indicators that we proposed for monetization. So this is just a very first proposal, and we argue here that there needs to be done more, but a minimal assessment in this case would mean that following the logic of the Trust Lab assessment, we would look at a sample of X number of content on all the platforms, depending on, I mean, we can say 1,000 pieces of content, 10,000, depending on how much money will be available for this exercise. And then we would, based on that sample, we would first look at the share of monetized content. And so we would zoom in on the monetized content in the whole sample. And we would look at the share of disinformation as part of this monetized content. This is a bit of it requires a lot of work, because it would mean that fact checkers have to look at every piece of advertising and assess themselves whether it's disinformation or not. And there's a reason why we can't just say there are 5,000 purveyors of disinformation that we know that they are lying, and we just look at whether they have monetized content. I will come back to this later, but we cannot do that. So here in this case, we would look at the sample, and in the sample of ads, we would look at the share of disinformation, and then we could look at it every 6 months and see how it changed. There's also a way, a possibility to look at a sample of advertising. So in that case, we would look at ads where so we would look at who paid for the ads, and then we would try to identify how many purveyors of disinformation have bought the advertising space. So this would look at the other side of the coin. And there's also the question of boosted content. So how many pieces were boosted, so paid to get extra visibility on a platform, and then we would try to estimate the share of disinformation. And of course, this wouldn't tell us a lot about the whole extent of the disinformation problem, but still it would create a benchmark, and we would probably be able to compare over 6 months, 12 months, years, what has changed on the platforms. Based on this methodology, it would also be possible to estimate the revenues that were made, either based on the impressions that they generated, or, which would be our preferred goal, would be to ask the platforms themselves to give us information on that. So we would tell them, here are these pieces of this information we identified. Tell us how much money was generated by that. Both are possible ways to do it, if the platforms agree to help us with that. Also, I wanted to mention an example, which was so that there was an assessment done by Science Feedback. I don't know if Bastian is here today. I saw that he registered, who also tried to make an estimate of purveyors of disinformation advertising. What they did is they created a list of 1,000-something content publishers who can be considered purveyors of disinformation. And then they looked at the content they created, and they tried to identify how much of them was monetized. So they did that by looking at the 10 latest pieces of content that they published, and if at least 3 of them had advertisement, then they considered it monetized content, or a monetized purveyor of disinformation. And they would then create a share of purveyors of disinformation monetized based on this methodology. Now, here the problem is that there are some considerations that, from a human rights point of view and freedom of expression point of view, we shouldn't label someone a purveyor of disinformation, because it's not the person who has to be judged, it's the content that has to be judged. There are still lots of discussions on that, because it's much easier to make calculations if you look at the person than if you look at the content. But it's also true that in an ideal world, you would be able to just judge based on each piece of content, whether it's disinformation or not, and then try to calculate exactly how much money was created with that, and also how much money was created with that piece of content for the purveyor of disinformation, and how much was created for the platform, which is also something that we need to know. And I think I would end with that at this point. Thank you, Paula.
All right. So to conclude, we hope we gave you some insights on the various economic flows, if you want, money flows, and also the incentives behind. But there's even more. So we just wanted to just put it here. So of course, as we said, the business models of the platform, the fact that there is monetization on content, payment to get the content through, so promoting content, as we were saying. There is the economic issue of the business model of the traditional media, but there's also other things, like, for example, the impact that disinformation can also make on like decisions that have economic consequences. Just let me mention 2 examples. You may remember, I think it was almost a year ago, that basically there was a fake, I think, Twitter account or X account of Eli Lilly, in which they were saying that insulin would be given for free in the US. That created an economic issue then for the company, because of course that was a fake account, but you can imagine the reactions to that and how they had to actually handle that, and the impact it had also on the title, like really on a financial point of view, this whole discussion that happened. And more recently, you know, when there was a kind of failure of the Silicon Valley Bank, there was lots of disinformation that then impacted another regional bank, which is called the First Republic Bank, that then also basically had very important actually losses and issues. So as you can see, I mean, if you want, the economic elements around this information actually go beyond what we're saying today. And then we thought it's important also to remind the cost of regulation, because of course, I mean, if you think about it, think of also the DSA, how much actually this entailed in not only, of course, for the platforms, but the fees that they will pay and so on, but think of the national regulatory authority. I mean, they will have to hire new staff to deal with the DSA and in general, and more specifically, sorry, with disinformation. If they don't hire new staff, they will have to pay for training for staff that is already there. Similarly in the European Commission, of course. And so it's also a cost, if you want, that is related to disinformation. So we wanted to bring it up to show that actually there's lots of economics around this information, and potentially also to invite researchers to focus even more on this topic. So now we know that we are already out of time.